we're live.
Okay. Good evening, friends, comrades, brothers and sisters. My name is Robbie Mahood, and I'm a member of Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste in Montreal, where this presentation is coming to you. Tonight, we're very glad to have Bruce Katz as our presenter, and the subject will be the weaponization of anti-Semitism, which is a very timely and important topic. Bruce is a founding member and current co-president of PAJU, which is Palestinian and Jewish Unity, a Montreal-based pro-Palestinian rights organization founded in 2000. PAJU was one of the first groups in Quebec to endorse the call for a boycott, divestment, and sanctions campaign against Israel, which was called for by 170 Palestinian organizations in 2005. Bruce has been a vocal critic of Israel's apartheid system and has published a number of articles on Palestinian issues in both French and English. He has been interviewed on numerous occasions on Palestinian rights and Israel's illegal occupation of Palestinian territory in French, English, and as well Spanish. So he's well qualified to address us on this topic. I'm very much looking forward to the presentation. So we will have questions and comments after Bruce's presentation. And I would also say that there is a business meeting of the Montreal Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste branch following the presentation, to which members and sympathizers or anybody interested can follow at the link, which is at the bottom of the YouTube screen. So without further ado, I'll throw the meeting open to Bruce, and we'll hear his presentation, and followed by questions and comments.
I'd like to first thank the Socialist Action for the opportunity to address the question of the accusation, actually the manipulation of the accusation of anti-Semitism, which is become so pervasive that it really has to be addressed. It's really, in terms of the process of intimidation that it represents, it's really something akin to the McCarthyism of the 1950s. Because I really want to approach the deconstruction of this whole manipulation of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. I'm going to present a brief paper that I put together just for this webcast. Let me begin with what has traditionally been accepted as a definition of anti-Semitism, and that is quite simply hostility toward or discrimination against Jews as a religious or collective group. Now, the attempt to include in the definition of anti-Semitism criticism of the state of Israel is a strategic plan adopted by the government of Israel decades ago, which has been revved up following the call to boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS campaign against Israel in 2005 by Palestinian civil society organizations. And then the Goldstone report condemning Israel's December 2008 to January 2009 attack on Gaza. And then again, the murderous Israeli attack on Gaza in 2014, all of which has resulted in vigorous criticism of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians. So, in short, this attempt to point the finger at critics of Israeli policy by using the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism represents a last-ditch effort to silence critics of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians by way of this process of intimidation. In fact, the greater the momentum gained by the BDS campaign against Israel's apartheid system, the more stringent the campaign to conflate criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism has become. I mentioned at the outset that this is the policy or the process of using accusations of anti-Semitism to silence critics is something that goes back at least five decades, and essentially it finds its source in Israel's Hasbara propaganda program or use of strategy. So, writing in the American Jewish Congress Biweekly in 1973, then Foreign Minister of Israel Abba Eban identified anti-Zionism as the new anti-Semitism. Basically, he's not the first one to coin, but he really pushed it forward, saying that it was the creation of the new left, which he called and I'll quote, the progenitor of the new anti-Semitism, end of quote. So in a cavalier manner, really devoid of any real analysis or debate, Abba Eban simply stated that he said again that anti-Zionism was anti-Semitism, but he's quoted as saying, and I'll quote, the old classic anti-Semitism declared that equal rights belong to all individuals within the society, except the Jews. The new anti-Semitism says that the right to establish and maintain an independent national sovereign state is the prerogative of all nations, so long as they happen not to be Jewish. End of quote. The question which begs asking, of course, is whether a Jewish state can also be a democratic state. And Israel's nation-state law, adopted on May 1st, 2018, provides the answer. The nation-state law, or basic law, as it's also called, makes the state of Israel an exclusive Jewish state where only Jews have the right of self-determination, as opposed to its non-Jewish Arab, Muslim, and Christian minorities who have no such right. In other words, the basic law establishes an ethnic state, not a democratic one. But there's been no critique of the discriminatory basic law by the proponents of the new anti-Semitism and supporters of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA definition, which is its propaganda offspring. In 1974, Arnold Forster and Benjamin Epstein of the Anti-Defamation League in the States published a book entitled The New Anti-Semitism, expressing additional concern about what they described as new manifestations of anti-Semitism coming from radical, meaning left, and pro-Arab figures in the U.S. Alan Brownfeld, in the Journal of Palestine Studies, subsequent to that, wrote that Forster and Epstein's new definition of anti-Semitism trivialized the concept by turning it into a form of political blackmail and a weapon with which to silence any criticism of either Israel or U.S. policy in the Middle East, and substantively, that's what it is. The IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which, as I said, is the propaganda offspring of the concept of the new anti-Semitism, is meant to do just that. Its role is to formalize and legalize the concept of the new anti-Semitism by having legislatures in various countries pass the IHRA definition into law. For example, the Trudeau government announced on June 25, 2019, that it would formally adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism as part of its anti-racism strategy. The government of Ontario unanimously passed Bill 168, which mandates the adoption of the IHRA working definition of anti-Semitism as a guide for government policies and public institutions. And Bill 168 would essentially delegitimize and potentially criminalize all criticisms of Israel and the extreme right Israeli government by qualifying it as anti-Semitic. Now, there was a considerable pushback from individuals and organizations in Ontario including, of course, Independent Jewish Voices, which was put forth a really vigorous criticism of it. And as a result, the government of Ontario brought it in really through the back door, did not put it through the legislature, but adopted it as an order in council, which does not carry the same weight as passing it through the legislature. But some people have called that a victory or partial victory, but I would caution people to be very wary of the fact that even if it was an order in council, that does not mean that it can't be applied later on, even if that may not seem likely at the present moment. And we've seen the same type of attempts in Europe and France, even in the United Kingdom. We all know about the smear campaign against Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour Party. On May 17th, 2019, the German Bundestag passed a resolution defining BDS campaigns against Israel as anti-Semitic. And this has been vigorously contested and continues to be contested by German intellectuals and the German political left. So, you see, this is a move which specifically targets the political left and free speech in general. And I might add that the Social Democratic Ontario NDP, to their shame, voted unanimously in favor of Bill 168 without even one single MPP opposing it. There's also been an attempt on the part of Zionist organizations in Canada to have municipal governments formally adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, such as was the case in Vancouver, Calgary, and Montreal. And in all three cases, they failed after a vigorous pushback from citizen groups, including the Independent Jewish Voices, and in Montreal, Independent Jewish Voices and PAJU. But the gist of what pro-Israel groups are trying to accomplish is clear enough. The campaign to amend the definition of anti-Semitism to include any and all critiques of Israeli policy toward the besieged Palestinian population living under Israeli occupation has among its sources a Canadian one. And this goes back to around to 2009, when a parliamentary committee called the Canadian Parliamentary Coalition to Combat Anti-Semitism was put together at the behest of Jason Kenney, who was then Minister of Citizenship, Immigration, and Multiculturalism in the Harper government, and Erwin Kotler, the former Justice Minister in the Liberal governments of Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. And incidentally, Justin Trudeau has chosen Erwin Kotler as, given him a title, Special Envoy on Preserving Holocaust Remembrance and Combating Anti-Semitism. And Kotler will lead the Canadian government's delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Conferences, where the same propaganda-oriented definition of anti-Semitism will be pushed, with the objective of building a wall of silence around all critiques of Israel. Now, add to that the creation of an unofficial task force headed by federal MPs and committed Zionists, Michael Levitt and Anthony Housefather of the Liberal Party, Randall Garrison of the NDP, and Marty Morantz of the Conservatives, the objective of which is to force Facebook and Twitter to adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So, you know, how is that for a McCarthy-like process of intimidation? It's really clearly a witch hunt. Trudeau has also appointed well-known Zionist Bob Ray as Canada's ambassador to the United Nations. So, you know, it's clear where Canada stands in reference to the Palestinian narrative and the question of Palestinian rights and Palestinian self-determination. Hence, the Trudeau government stands firmly in support of apartheid. Only just today, January the 12th, 2021, the Guardian newspaper in the United Kingdom published an article in which Israel's very prominent human rights organization, B'Tselem, states that Israel's not a democracy but an apartheid regime that enforces Jewish supremacy over all the land it controls, end of quote. The IHRA definition is the political tool designed to silence opposition to that apartheid regime. The new anti-Semitism, such as it was presented via the aforementioned Canadian Parliamentary Committee, included in that much broadened definition of anti-Semitism the critique of Israel's institutionalized system of discrimination as being that of apartheid. Hence, to call Israel an apartheid state was made itself a manifestation of anti-Semitism as it stood in opposition to the idea of the self-determination of the Jewish people as a people. But it should be noted that the Jewish religion is absent from the equation. Here, Jewish self-determination is synonymous with ethnicity. Or as Professor Yaakov Rapkin of the University of Montreal has so aptly stated it, it's about the creation of the new Hebrew man, one who has shed Yiddish as the language of the defeated in favor of a reconstituted modern Hebrew. And the new Hebrew man has also shed the Jewish religion and the God of the Israelites in favor of the state as divinity. And evidently, to call this the modern worship of the golden calf would be liable to censure as an expression of anti-Semitism. So I believe that is the case, so that would make me an anti-Semitic Jew, which is quite ironic as a statement. The worship of the state as a religious object is nevertheless idolatry. And to defend it by way of the IHRA definition does not render it any less idolatrous. In what is certainly an explosive and hence a controversial article, Israeli citizen Orly Noy, who is a member of the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem's executive board and an activist with Israel's Balad political party, writing in the Jewish Anti-Zionist 972 magazine on November 20, 2020, states that if, and I'll quote her, if Zionism previously justified its crimes against the Palestinians in the name of the Holocaust, today it uses it as a tool to justify anti-Semitism itself. She's referring to two things here. She's referring to the close relationship of Benjamin Netanyahu and Likud to Donald Trump, who's certainly a well-known racist and certainly an anti-Semite. But she's also making a reference to Effie Etam, who is also a well-known Israeli racist, but who has been made named to head Yad Vashem in Israel, which is, of course, the Holocaust Memorial Institution. So let me quote the final three paragraphs of her article because they strike at the very heart of the manipulated notion of anti-Semitism, which has been pushed by Israel and its minions for 5 decades and has culminated in the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. And here is what she writes, and I will read the 3 paragraphs. Again, as I said, she says, if Zionism previously justified its crimes against the Palestinian people in the name of the Holocaust, today it uses the Holocaust as a tool to justify anti-Semitism itself in exchange for political profit. More than that, it allows an anti-Semite to define what anti-Semitism is. And this is the bitter truth we face today. For the official state of Israel, the concept of the Holocaust and anti-Semitism are purely political means, and as such can be manipulated, distorted, and deceived just like any other political tool. After they dispossessed the Palestinians under the pretext of the Holocaust, Israeli leaders are now adopting an anti-Semite like Trump, will persecute the descendants of those same dispossessed Palestinians in the name of fighting anti-Semitism. And not only them, but also the countless Jews who show solidarity for the Palestinian struggle for justice. However, as long as there are people of conscience who shiver at the sight of this heinous exploitation of the Holocaust memory, this will be difficult to do. And this is why Effie Etam, a racist and proponent of war crimes, has been appointed to guard the memory of Jewish tragedy, so that the Holocaust forever remains subject to utilitarian and political manipulation. That is how Israel honors the dead in 2020. The end of her article. So what is inferred as well in Orly Noy's article is the danger that this manipulation of anti-Semitism poses for Jews as a whole, because Zionism succeeded in absorbing Judaism into the notion of the state, and thereby secularizing and ethnicizing Judaism, while emptying it of its transcendent nature and strict moral code, which issues from precepts of the Torah and Mosaic code. So in other words, in order to create the new Hebrew man, as Yaakov Rapkin coined the term in his book, A Threat from Within, A Century of Jewish Opposition to Zionism, it was first necessary to evacuate the transcendent nature of Judaic normative principles in order to substitute the state for the God of the Israelites. The state, however, cannot itself be conflated with Judaism or with Jews as a collectivity, and no amount of sophistry will change that. In the case of the state of Israel, its worship should be called Israelism and not Judaism. To claim that the state of Israel is the embodiment of all the world's Jews is not only a falsehood, but a dangerous one. For if the state of Israel is guilty of crimes inflicted upon a neighboring people, and if the extrapolation is made that this state also embodies all of world Jewry, then all Jews are made to share a collective guilt with this same state, though many Jews oppose that state's actions. This results in refurbishing old prejudices and stereotypes and stokes the fires of anti-Jewish sentiment. This especially at a moment in time when we are witnessing the rise of fascist movements reminiscent of the 1920s and 1930s. So given the actual social and political context of our times, it's necessary that those progressive elements of society that defend human rights, the rule of law, and freedom of expression stand firmly against all forms of racism, including anti-Semitic acts of hatred against Jews, both as a religious and collective group, but also make the necessary distinction between protecting the religious and civil rights of Jews and the false worship of Israelism. So that's my presentation, and if there are questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Bruce, for that dissection of the political manipulation of anti-Semitism and giving us a real grounding in the history of that and a corrective to that shameful manipulation. So we're going to throw it open for questions and comments. Do I need guidance on this? I guess, would anybody like to ask a question or add a comment?
Well, seeing as Barry said that he will be stepping out in 4 minutes, maybe he can post a question first, and then Bruce can answer that, and then I'll go to the audience.
May I just state the question rather than write it into the chat?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, well, first of all, I want to thank Bruce for an excellent presentation. And it's a pleasure speaking as the Federal Secretary of Socialist Action, Ligue pour l'Action Socialiste. It's a pleasure for us to work with you and with the other components of the Canadian BDS Coalition Coast to Coast. We've worked on many projects, including the Days of Action in Solidarity with Palestine and marking the Nakba, the disaster, with events in May and June this past year and the year before. So it's certainly a pleasure. I want with my question to draw attention to analysis that I saw today on the internet, that the Zionist destruction of Palestinian homes on the West Bank is more now than ever since the Oslo Agreement in 1993-95. Some viewers will remember that that was an accord signed in Washington, and then a codicil signed 2 years later, which supposedly guaranteed Palestinians the right to a state of their own and non-interference and to live peacefully side by side the Zionist state. But of course, the Zionist state is an expansionist state. It's a colonial settler state, and it's built on the lands of people who were expelled from their homeland. So the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which proscribes any allusion to anti-Zionism, to criticism of Israel, is an attempt, a transparent attempt, to divert attention away from the crimes that are now occurring in the West Bank, to say nothing of, the siege of Gaza, which the Palestinians pay a very, very heavy toll. So that's my observation, and I wonder if you can contribute to that, Bruce. And thanks once again for appearing on this show.
As you mentioned, the demolition of Palestinian domiciles goes on unchecked. This is this is part and parcel of the vision of that goes right back to Ze'ev Jabotinsky, who was basically the originator of revisionist Zionism. This is something that needs to be understood, is that even so-called liberal Zionists pretend that somehow Zionism is a beneficial socialist movement, but that's never really been the case. If you look at what revisionist Zionism is about, it was from the outset about the idea of Greater Israel, simply meaning that all land, which was at one point part of the historic British mandate, being Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, should belongs to the Zionists by virtue of the Bible. God gave us the land. So that's it's a very easy pretext to use in order to gobble up all of the land that's not yours. And what we're seeing is just yesterday, the Netanyahu announced that 800 more settlement units will be built, and the expansion goes unchecked. There is no question whatsoever of sanctions against Israel, even if the United Nations makes references to Israeli aggression and non-respect of international law and the rule of law. Basically, Washington will always cover for whatever Israel decides to do, because Israel was created as a beachhead in the Middle East to permit, it goes back to Sykes-Picot clandestine negotiations. It was one of the ways that Britain and France decided they would carve up the Middle East, and created 14 artificial countries, including Saudi Arabia and others, in order to exploit the oil and natural gas resources of the Middle East. So essentially, the United States, Washington, inherited the policies of Great Britain in the past, and this is the way it continues. Now, where we may see changes is the fact that the United States is in the process of imploding, as you've seen by the attacks on the Capitol. That's not something that's going away. This is just the first wave of things that I think, unfortunately, for the American people, that are going to manifest itself more and more. That's a polarized country, and that polarization is not going anywhere away any day soon. So we'll see how that impacts on American policy in the Middle East. But you're right, the expansion goes on unchecked.
Are there any further comments or questions?
Oh,
I can make one if there isn't anybody on the list.
well, we do have some from our YouTube audience, so I'll just go over the first three, and then I will go back to our speaker. Okay, first is Betty Jane Antanavicius. I was under the impression that the Palestinians were Semites as well. And then Dinner was Franklin asks, are Palestinians and or Arab Israelis being given access to the COVID-19 vaccine? And Julius asked, is it likely that the government will intervene in body-supporting campaigns like BDS even with the passing of Bill 168 in Ontario? Won't such actions blow the issue wide open, potentially causing embarrassment of the government and building our forces?
I'm just noting down those questions. Do you want me to? The first question: are Palestinians certainly are Semites? The Arabs are Semites. So it's one of the I've always found this to be interesting that people would talk about anti-Semitism as being specifically referring to acts of hostility against Jews, but the Arabs are Semites. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting that the Palestinians who have been in the region for millennia, they could probably trace ancestry if it were possible to do it. They could probably trace ancestry back to Jewish ancestors centuries ago. So most definitely the Palestinians are Semites. And you could say sort of ironically that acts of hostility against the Palestinians as Palestinians are anti-Semitic acts. The second question was about, and this is something that has been in the media lately, the fact that indeed Israel has not been permitting the COVID-19 vaccines to be administered to the Palestinians. There was Charlie Angus of the NDP, and there's another MP whose name escapes me, made a comment about this, about Israel not administering or refusing to administer COVID-19 vaccine to Palestinians. And there's an organization called Honest Reporting Canada. There's a real misnomer for you. Honest should be dishonest reporting. Claimed that this was all invented, that this was not happening. But in fact, there is one Israeli organization that is active on the ground, and I forget the name of the organization, in Israel, which has stated unequivocally that the Palestinians are not receiving the COVID-19 vaccine. So that's a fact. The third question dealt with, do you think that that governments will be embarrassed by this question? Will there be some kind of a blowback? If I understood the question correctly, I think that we're beginning to see the reversal of this whole process of attempting to use accusations of anti-Semitism to stifle free speech, and there's a vigorous pushback on the part of intellectuals on left-wing organizations, of course, not on the part of Keir Starmer, the Zionist leader of the British Labour Party, who has stabbed Jeremy Corbyn in the back. But yes, given the fact that politicians who hold power tend to be opportunistic, as the wind changes direction, as it invariably will, I think we begin to see them backing away from support for the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I might say this, by the way. I considered François-Philippe Champagne, who has now been removed from the position of the Minister of Foreign Affairs for Canada. I consider him to be rather weak and ineffectual. And I noticed that now Marc Garneau has been named. I will say this, that I don't think that the naming of Marc Garneau is going to make much of a difference in terms of Canada's woeful policy on the Middle East and the Palestinian question in general. He has been known to be a committed pro-Israel, basically Zionist, certainly pro-Zionist. So I really don't think Canadian policy is going to be impacted very much by that change.
Thank you, Bruce. Are there any other questions or comments, Kurt?
I have more, but I think you should ask your question.
Well, actually, it was mostly covered. Yeah, I just was going to point out that the rollout of the vaccine in Israel is much touted as one of the more effective rollouts, but we forget that it's principally the Israeli Jewish population, not excluding Palestinian Israelis or Palestinian citizens of Israel, but definitely excluding the millions of Palestinians that live in the occupied territories and in the Gaza territory, which is under siege. So those are really egregious examples of the way a colonial settler situation with an ongoing apartheid arrangement plays out at the level of basic public health measures. Of course, I mean, Israel's not the only example of that, because we have an unequal situation with respect to the pandemic, not only in the richest capitalist countries of the world, the United States being one of the main examples, but also between rich countries and poor countries all over the world. And there's a maldistribution of health resources and of efforts to fight the pandemic. So that's one of the fronts on which we have to be active. And certainly Israel is one of the places that this shows up most graphically, but it's not the only instance.
Yeah, I think also that when you look at this rush on the part of Netanyahu to vaccinate as many Israelis as possible, that's directly tied to the fact that he faces an election in March, and it's an uphill one for him. There's a lot at stake for him, similar to Trump. You know, Trump, he could possibly pardon himself at the federal level, but if New York State decides to go ahead and go after him on tax evasion and a couple of other charges, they can do so, and he could face a possible prison term. Netanyahu also faces the possibility of prison term if he loses the election. And right now he holds the short end of the stick because Likud has basically splintered, and this is kind of his the last straw effort to try to hang on and eke out a narrow political victory in the month of March, and that's the question of administering as many vaccines to as many Israelis as possible is really political in nature. This is not someone who really cares about his fellow man. That's fairly obvious.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. Any other comments or questions?
Okay, we have 3 questions that I'll be asking. The first comes from Dennis Kosim. He's asked, Bruce, you mentioned the Guardian article that talks about B'Tselem, the Israeli Human Rights Association stance on Israel apartheid. Does that make IHRA definition a way of supporting apartheid? Peter Elgin asks, if attacking the political left was part of the motivation for the invention of the new anti-Semitism from 1973, what is the motivation for the Canadian government to adopt the IHRA definition? And Life Breaks Through asks, what are implications of Trudeau's appointment of Kotler to be anti-Semitism and IHRA cop in Canada? Are they undertaking top-down imposition of IHRA on Canadian institutions? What can we do to disrupt?
Oh, this is a good question. I want to say hello to Denny Kasim, who's a personal friend of mine, and we were in Palestine together 10 years ago. Yes, you know, I think I'm not sure. I think I may have stated in my presentation. IHRA exists as the political tool to enforce apartheid by silencing all critiques of it as being anti-Semitic in nature. And as I said, this is a last-ditch effort on really a reactionary movement, and what I would consider to be the rear guard of a failing movement, which is desperately attempting to keep the international community from criticizing and especially from at some point imposing sanctions on what is clearly an apartheid state, an apartheid state that has refused to accept more than 100 UN resolutions on Palestine, beginning in 1948 and continuing on to the present. So yes, you're absolutely right, Dennis, on the question of the use of IHRA as a political tool to reinforce apartheid. I think the second one dealt with the Canadian government's adoption of or promise to adopt the IHRA definition. Generally speaking, and that's just from 1947 on, we don't have the time to analyze really the presence of Canadian diplomatic mission at the United Nations in 1947 with Lester B. Pearson. But essentially, Pearson caved into pressure from both the United States and the Soviet Union. They had the two of them had different objectives as to what they wanted to accomplish, but they both wanted the British out of Palestine. And basically, he caved into their pressure and accepted a very, very bad division of Palestine, which gave 56% of the land to 33% of the population, which was Jewish at that time, and 44% to 67%, which was the Palestinian Arab. So that from 1947 on, you have basically Canadian governments that fall into line with Washington's policy in the Middle East. And this became aggravated as of the presence of Paul Martin as Prime Minister, who began to appoint committed Zionists to his cabinet. I'm thinking specifically of Erwin Kotler and Jacques Sada. And that increases with Stephen Harper and with Justin Trudeau. The Trudeau government, by the way, is probably even more committed to a pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian stance in terms of foreign policy in the Middle East than even the Harper government. So when you look at, for example, at votes by the government of Canada at the United Nations when it's a question of Palestinian issues, generally speaking, they will always vote with Israel and the United States, and of course with other world powers like Palau, Micronesia, and the Marshall Islands. And very rarely, very rarely will vote in favor of any resolution that criticizes Israel. And let me give you an example of a two-faced approach by the Trudeau government to the whole Palestinian question. Fatou Bensouda, who is the special prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, to which Canada is a signatory, by the way. It was formed by the Rome Statute, and Canada is signatory to that. Fatou Bensouda stated that there was enough evidence of war crimes committed by Israel Defense Forces in the West Bank and especially Gaza to make it necessary for there to be an investigation into war crimes on the part of Israel. That was blocked, essentially by the Trump administration, putting pressure, canceling her visa to the United States, etc. But a spokesperson, I can't remember his name, spokesperson for Global Affairs Canada, sided with Israel by stating that Palestine is not a state, therefore it has no recourse to demand an investigation into war crimes on its in Palestinian territory. And after that, some weeks after, went to the United Nations and voted in favor of Palestinian self-determination. So Palestine does not exist, but Palestinian self-determination should be respected. I mean, if you want to look at the blatant hypocrisy of the Canadian government's policies on Palestinian issues in the Middle East, that about sizes it up. There was a third question on Trudeau and Kotler and just where they might want to go on with IHRA. I mentioned in my presentation that if you look at the inner workings of Liberal government, the Liberal Party of Canada, you notice that there is a plethora of pro-Israel lobby elements within their ranks. I made a reference to Michael Levitt, to Anthony Housefather, Bob Ray, who was appointed as ambassador to the UN. Erwin Cotler, some years back, and I remember this distinctly, Justin Trudeau mentioned that Erwin Cotler is his mentor. So I'm not sure if Trudeau understands what exactly is involved in the attempt to silence critics of Israel by using a false notion of anti-Semitism. Either he doesn't have the intellectual capacity to understand it, or he does understand it, and he is willing to apply it anyway, which is certainly shameful. I would mention to listeners and viewers that only just recently I was able to publish a 3-part article on Erwin Cotler in the Canada Files, and you can Google it. Just look for Bruce Katz, the Canada Files, and the title Erwin Cotler, the False Humanitarian. And I think that in itself will explain exactly what his presence represents within the government of Canada. Let me also mention this, by the way. When we start to look at Canadian foreign policy, Cotler has been involved, along with Chrystia Freeland, in adopting a really right-wing authoritarian policy, neo-colonialist policy in Latin America, the Caribbean, the Middle East, and in Africa. And I mentioned the fact that Cotler targets specifically Iran and Venezuela because both of those countries have been severely critical of Israeli policy toward the Palestinians. And in Venezuela, it goes back to Hugo Chavez. I might also mention that for those who may remember, the White Helmets who were working in Syria and were supposedly a humanitarian organization, but there's a good deal of documentation that shows that they were connected to Islamic State combatants. Now, when the Syrian government forces were closing in on the Islamic State combatants, the White Helmets were taken out of Syria. How? Basically by a triumvirate, really. The actions of Chrystia Freeland, Erwin Cotler, and Benjamin Netanyahu. Cotler has an in with Likud. He's very close to. He's on a first name basis with Netanyahu. He has relations with other right elements in the Knesset, and I find it very, very interesting that he played a pivotal role in getting the White Helmets out of Syria and into Canada. That's curious. So I do not think we should underestimate the role that Cotler intends to play in trying to push the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism within various countries, using IHRA conferences as the springboard.
Thanks, Bruce. I guess we're approaching maybe the time when we should bring the presentation to conclusion. I actually had one more remark I wanted to make. I don't know if I get to
Robbie, we have several questions from first-time remarks. people, so I think it would be best that we do that. I myself also have a question, so.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So we don't have that much time left. I think this would be best to be our last round. So, Bruce, I'd just like you to speak to the fact that over the holidays, I've been following the Toronto Star, and in the Toronto Star, if you read through their online reports, and potentially many of those also showed up in their paper, they were talking about things like, the upcoming potential prosecution of Benjamin Netanyahu, as well as an incident wherein one Israeli woman was murdered in the West Bank, but refused to speak on issues like the fact that the Gaza Strip was bombed on Christmas, or actually on the 26th, and that Israel bombed Syria on Christmas. No mention of those two incidents whatsoever in the Toronto Star. Could you speak to that? And before we have two more questions from our audience, so I'll ask them now. Tristan Morneau asks, as a Canadian, what are the most important companies to boycott?
Sorry about that. It was just my cell that went off there for a second.
Okay,
yeah.
I'll start from the beginning of this question. Tristan Morneau asks, as a Canadian, what are the most important companies to boycott in order to not give money to supporters of Israel? And do any companies outspokenly support the Palestinians?
Okay.
And Robert McDermott asks, how did pro-Zionist positions become so dominant in Canada? Influence of Zionist groups, influence of corporations and money, great power politics. Okay.
Okay. We start with the very interesting and very also valid question about bombing of the Gaza Strip on Christmas of all. It's not acceptable at any time, especially not at Christmas, and Syria. Now, what's been going on in Gaza? Gaza, whenever Netanyahu has had a political problem in the past, one of the ways that he tries to rev up his support among the right and extreme right wing in Israel is to bomb Gaza on any pretext. So it's an old story. There's a blockade that's been going on for 14 years, which constitutes, in my opinion, a crime against humanity. The bombing of Syria, they've been having bombing forays into Syria now for several years. Now the question is, how is it that this never gets into the media here, at least the corporate media? Not even when we talk about corporate media, I include the Radio Canada and the CBC in that. I don't even consider them to be a public broadcaster when it comes to international issues. There is among the media a systematic suppression of the Palestinian narrative, and anything that points to Israeli crimes against the Palestinian civilian population or against targets in Syria. I could give you a number of examples of my own experience over 20 years. Let me give you one, because that basically sums up what the attitudes are of media here. In 2017, I got a text message from CBC National News, for a journalist wanted to interview me the following day on camera. on the issue, and said, I'll get back to you in 15 minutes. Well, 15 minutes became 60 minutes, but I had already foreseen that from experience, and I texted the journalist and said, what's up? And the journalist answered, I'm in a meeting. I'll get back to you in 15 minutes. So as soon as I heard a meeting, I understood what's going on. The journalist got back to me and said, we can't go forward with the interview. RDE, which is Radio Canada French News, has reserved all its cameras for tomorrow. So, I mean, this is the way that any excuse is good, but nothing that shows Israeli crimes will be seen on corporate media in this country. It's only alternative media that will show it. It's very rare that you'll see any reference to Israeli crimes and Palestinian suffering in any corporate media in this country, and that includes the CBC and the Radio Canada. The second question was about what companies or corporations to boycott, and you know there are a number of them. There are Canadian, for example, the Canada Pension Plan. There's lots of investments that go into Israel and Israeli banks, etc. Leumi Bank, but I'll draw attention to two in particular. One is HP products, computers, printers, etc. Because of their investment in Israel. Another one is Puma, which right now is being boycotted by the Palestinian BNC, Palestinian National Boycott Council. Puma operates even in not just in Israel but in occupied territory, West Bank, and supports Israeli football teams or soccer teams in the illegal settlements which have been built on stolen Palestinian land. So, you know, there are other ones. I would suggest maybe that you could also go onto the website of Innovative Minds, which is in the United Kingdom. Innovative Minds. They have a whole list of companies that do business in Israel. Bombardier, for example, has been involved in that. Sorry about that. Last question is, what is the strength of why is Zionism as strong as it is? Let me just shut this off. Why is Zionism as pervasive as it is in Canada? Well, that has a lot to do with many years of organization, and it goes back a long way. Zionists and Zionist organizations have made very important inroads into the corridors of power over many years. They are very well organized. They also have the backing of Israel in terms of support, propaganda support, for example, Hasbara. Also, politicians in this country are simply afraid to stand on principle and hold them accountable for their support of a really what is a racist apartheid state. But you know, when you look, for example, look at the support within the Liberal Party of Canada for pro-Zionist elements in the business world and within their own ranks. And what you have is, I remember speaking to some years ago, speaking to a couple of parliamentarians in Ottawa, who told me, and I will not use their names, told me in confidence that pro-Israel lobbyists are found everywhere in the corridors of power. They are there. They are on the ground. And in contrast, we could maybe refer to Canadians for Justice and Peace in the Middle East, who tried to lobby in favor of Palestinians and on Palestinian issues. But the Israel lobby in Canada is quite pervasive. But I will say this: they're losing feathers. I think, especially because of the overkill on the part of organizations like the B'nai B'rith and Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, who accuse individuals who dare criticize Israel of being anti-Semites, and they throw it out left and right. But at some point, overkill results in blowback, and I think we're starting to see that on the ground. For example, a question of the University of Toronto trying where the Judge Spiro, who is going to be investigated, by the way, apparently who's a generous donor to the University of Toronto, would have contacted the rector, I forget his name, Yokoka, not to hire a certain Professor Azarova who had criticized Israel. That is starting to come out in the media, and as a result, I expect the Israel lobby to continue to lose feathers. So I would say to the person who asked the question, not to despair. They are fighting a rear guard action, and they are actually retreating. I think that the victory will come at some point. I'm quite confident of it.
Thank you, Bruce. Well, I guess we're ready to bring this presentation to a close. I'm going to grab the opportunity to just leave one parting comment, because I think it's an interesting one and provides food for thought, so that we start to figure out why it is that the Trudeaus of the world are so resolutely pro-Zionist. And it's a quote from Stephen Saleta, who is a Palestinian American activist who himself has suffered victimization by pro-Zionist power in the United States. But he said, I think it's a very interesting quote. He said, Zionism informs class loyalty as strongly as it does ideological devotion. I think we see both aspects of this, but we shouldn't forget about the class alignment between Israel and Zionism and the world's most powerful capitalist states, including Canada, the United States, Britain, France, etc. So I think that's a quote worth keeping in mind, and we should try to explore that further, because we often find that there's a kind of, can be even an anti-Semitic subtext. Oh, well, you know, the power of Zionism is because of the power of the Jewish lobby. Well, we've got to decouple Judaism from Zionism. We shouldn't accept that. And I think this idea of class alignment is a very, very important point.
I think that's very valid comment, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so with that, I think we'll close the presentation and move on to the business part of the meeting. For those who are members or supporters or who want to stay, you're quite welcome to. And I guess, Kurt, we're just going to continue with the same format.
Yes, we will. I will inform all of our viewers on YouTube, if you wish to join us in our meeting at the Montreal branch meeting for Socialist Action. The link is in the description. So hope to see you if you are willing to join us. Good night.
Good night, all, and thank you for participating. And special